Okay, we're just going to spend a minute or two talking about respect for evidence as one of the basic stance things. And I suppose I want to just start, before I ask you, I suppose I'm still thinking, well, I guess we know that for quite a lot of clinicians or workers in the field, this kind of thing about evidence is slightly off-putting, and I suppose I want to recognise that. So what is it why have we wanted to stick with this whole idea of respect for evidence? Do you want to give us a starter on that?
Well, I suppose from a mentalising point of view, one of the ways which people demonstrate non-mentalising is what we call pretend mode.
Okay.
And one of the ways of making sense of pretend mode is when there's a lot of this, and there's sort of no connection to what's real,
okay,
and what's actually happening in the room.
Right.
And that can cut both ways. People can do a lot of this about evidence, and in fact it's completely meaningless in this particular circumstance.
Okay.
But equally, people can go on about ways of working that actually there's absolutely no evidence that they're effective or safe even.
Yeah.
And so I suppose out of a respect for the young people that we're working for and the families we're working for, I think we are agreed that we owe it to them that where there is evidence for something being effective, we should be trying to use that rather than assume that you or I or anyone else can just kind of make it up as we go along and that we'll be just as good.
I suppose what I understand is that obviously the evidence tends to be built around probably young people. Well, the evidence about what works in terms of psychological treatments for young people tends to be built around young people who are probably a bit more compliant than the sort of young people that ambit teams are working with. So that so what might work for slightly more compliant young people, we don't know how well some of this works for some of the more troubled young people that ambit teams work with, some of who don't easily make use of mainstream services. I suppose, but even with that in mind, I wonder if we could, between us, whether we could just think of one or two things that we think there is reasonably good evidence about why we might do something rather than something else. I mean, if you had to pick out one, what would
I think one of the ones that I think would be a really simple example would be, how do you work with a young person who is telling you about really very significant anxiety that's making them rather phobic of or avoidant of using any kind of public transport.
Right.
Actually not an uncommon problem for young people.
Yep.
And there's really quite a strong body of evidence that what we would call a cognitive behavioural approach, you might call that graded exposure,
yep,
is the most effective, the fastest, and the most well-evidenced psychological approach to helping a young person.
And graded exposure being just really encouraging a young person to reduce the amount of avoidance of that thing that they're nervous about. To start in an ordinary language, to give it a go, but in a rather kind of careful and systematic way rather than in a disorganised way. So sort of encourage.
So that'd be an example of the kind of,
okay,
where there is evidence, I think we should use it.
Yep.
We also have mentioned the fact that in this cohort of young people, this group, who don't tend to come to clinics, who maybe don't have families that are motivated to bring them to clinics, who maybe have families who are actually motivated to say, don't come and see these guys.
Absolutely.
There is not a huge amount of evidence.
Yep.
Robust, large numbers, proper, well-conducted trials. There's a few.
Yep.
So we are in much murkier territory, and often what we're taking is ways of working that work in a clinic that are less tried out in a family home or in a youth club or whatever the setting that the young person is agreeing to see us in.
Right.
So there is that. And then there's another element to respect for evidence that I just think we ought to also add in, which is not just about us, trying to do the best for the young people we're working in, but also acknowledging the fact that because there's very little evidence, we would see it as kind of part of good ambit practice
We
to try and
some.
develop some evidence.
Yeah.
Work
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Is what we're doing working? Because, and again, I would see that as entirely fitting with the mentalising stance, where sort of it's a tentative, curious, not knowing stance. Look, these are some thoughts I have about what's effective, but I don't know. But I'm sure as hell going to try and measure it in some way that will mean that maybe later down the line, a year later, 2 years later, I've got some further evidence. So it's about using evidence where we've got evidence, developing evidence by measuring our outcomes, start and end.
Yeah.
And
I guess in other parts of the manual and in other parts of the ambient approach, we try and give some suggestions about how teams can be encouraged to be a bit more systematic about identifying those kids where what they've done has seemed to be helpful, and those kids where what we've done as part of our work with them has been less effective. So we can learn from where we're effective and where we're not so effective. So that's, I suppose, what you'd say is local evidence.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.